So before I was a Unitarian Universalist minister, I spent over 25 years as a social worker. And I primarily worked with families, and these were families in crisis or profound change. In the interviewing I did was to gather certain information. I was conducting an assessment. At least half the time I was doing these assessments for family court. I did this by getting people not to just give me a bunch of details and data, but it was to tell stories. And then I would start comparing the narrative they told about themselves to the reality I was seeing. Now think of that Joan Didion quote, right? The more troubled the family, the more difference between the stories they were telling and the reality I observed. And in other words, they were often in denial about their own actions and how well they were functioning. Sometimes this distortion was due to some sort of really major mental health issue, but often they were just overwhelmed. Perhaps they had not had the best coping skills in their life. Or for some people, they were in so much grief they just couldn't see a better answer at that moment. So my job was to help them rewrite their story into the better functioning that they wanted for themselves and for their kids. And that is the second element involved, the adaptive one. People rewrite stories with and for a better outcome. How often do you say to yourself, or you hear it from other people, but it's more important when you're saying it to yourself, what I should have done was this. What I should have said was that, right? We get into a moment, we get flustered, we can't figure it out, but later we figure it out. And if you pause in that moment and rehearse that better outcome, you're rewriting the story. And what you are doing is rehearsing for the next time that dynamic comes around. You'll be better prepared. Whereas if you run away from it, pretend it didn't happen, use all your defenses, you're probably not going to learn. I'm walking around this week in the aftermath of not one ankle sprain, but two. The first one, which really was a minor one, there's a story of me running through baggage claim to catch the shuttle because I knew if I could just get to that shuttle, I could get on it and it would save me an hour and I could connect with the person on the other end. Okay, that was the first sprain. It was a minor one. I literally missed that shuttle by 1 minute, like by 1 minute. And I was yelling at the person going out the door to the shuttle, tell him to wait, but they didn't. So my rewrite of that story, because this will happen to me again, that I'll be like, there's 6 minutes to the shuttle, I can make it. So my rewrite is, yeah, that's not worth it. Let's just slow down. Let's just get some tea. Let's just crack that book open again. You didn't finish it on the airplane. Just chill. And if I'd done that, I'd still have a healthy foot and I wouldn't be in my hiking boots up here this morning. But I rewrote that story so that I could be smarter and so I could learn from that experience. So this morning, I just want to focus a little on rewriting stories and why it's important. Storytelling happens to be our Soul Matters theme this month. And we have Soul Matters it's an umbrella that provides us with chalice lightings and food for thought. There's a curriculum for the kids' classroom. They're doing storytelling this morning. Well, they're learning about how they tell stories. And our chalice circle discusses the same theme every month. So the theme is sort of moving around the church. And my column in the newsletter also reflects it often. So our brains are designed to construct narratives. It does that because it's more efficient, is what the hypothesis is. We don't remember a random bunch of facts very well, but we do remember experiences. People tend to remember, when they do need to remember facts, they remember it more accurately if they experience it in a story rather than on a list. We also know, several studies show that we respond better to when We're more likely to believe an argument is convincing, that it's true, when it's built into a narrative rather than just a legal precedent. Our knowledge of, we have an example right here in Montana of Held versus Montana, because a lot of us know those families. A good chunk of you know those families. So we can hold on to a little bit more about that story. So I have some research I wanted to talk about this morning, and a few more stories woven in. There's a book, two books that I'm going to recommend, and the first one is called The Redemptive Self. So this is by a researcher, Dan McAdams, and the book title is The Redemptive Self. And he studies how people describe their internal thoughts based on story. And so when he interviews people, he asks them to recall various times of their life. And he said, people they recite like it's chapters in a book. They'll recite this, they'll tie it up, and then they move on to the next chapter. They'll describe scenes in really crucial detail, including high points and low points. And in many will include what was a turning point for them in that story. So he went on to pair that with functioning in their adult lives. So first he's looking at how people tell the story, and then he's like, well, okay, how are they doing? And what he noticed is that people with mood problems, I hate labeling this, but people who feel they have anxiety, they have depression, they tend to share a positive story, but then at the end they add on a little really difficult piece at the end. Whereas people who might almost describe the same thing will tell the hard part at the beginning, and then they'll tell what they learned. So they might have failed at something, but then they met someone who helped them, or they came upon some way of having more wisdom. They tried again and they were successful. Or they intensely grieved a separation and a divorce, but went on to do things and meet people that they would not have done otherwise. Similar events, but ending on a difficult note versus a narrative of epiphanies and second chances. Now, the good news for this group is you can change how you do that. So he also found that these stories drive people's behavior. The behavior becomes predictable based on what kind of story they're telling. Should they marry this person? Should they take this job? Should they do this volunteering? For the older set, should they move across the country to be with their adult children and grandchildren? So they rely on explicit stories, but what is really tricky is when you're relying on the implicit story underneath, because you don't know you're relying on it. And I think that's the point of the sermon this morning, is to get those hidden ones up on the surface so you can work with them. There's another book that is called Redirect, which is similar to The Redemptive Self. I think they play very nicely off of each other. And this is by researcher Timothy Wilson. He's a professor of psychology at the University of Virginia. And his process, his buzzwords are called story editing. And he says, we all have personal stories about who we are and what the world is like. And these stories aren't necessarily conscious, but they are the way we live our lives. Many of us are healthy and optimistic. Those stories serve us well. But sometimes we all develop pessimistic stories, and we get caught in that self-defeating thinking. We assume the worst, and as a result, we don't consider all of our options, and we cope poorly. So he says, take time to re-edit that story. And because he's at the University of Virginia, he, of course, researches on college students. I mean, it's like college students and retired people are the two groups that always get, researchers are always after them. So because he had college students at his disposal, he took several hundred, divided them into two groups. But the students he collected were students who weren't doing well academically in their freshman year. And then he divided that group in half. He had the control group who got no intervention, but the other group he was going to have them kind of write a future story. Now, both groups felt like maybe they couldn't cut it in college, maybe this wasn't for them, maybe they weren't up to the task. So they were all having that same self-talk. But then this group they were given information that other students start in college this way and go on to do well. And they had videos from seniors at the same university saying, hey, I started out on this track, and these are the things I learned, and you can too. And so then, of course, they followed the students into the next year, and the students in this group went on to do much better, reported much more confidence in themselves. And they thought more about how they could get these skills that they needed. Go to the writing center, get a tutor. And the control group had significant higher levels of students who left college. It's always horrible for the control group. It's like, oh, come on, come back. We'll do the study over again. We'll give you the intervention. So the same thing can be applied to your job, your volunteer opportunity, your social setting. If you're struggling to adopt the story, I'm not cut out for this. You have a much higher chance of quitting. But if you adapt a story that I really believe in this work and I think I can be good at it, but I've got a lot to learn and I'm going to figure it out, which questions to ask and who I'm going to ask, which of course takes courage to go ask in the first place. And the great thing about this is it translates into the next environment. I have so much to say, and yet I'm looking at the clock. So think about, as you go on through this week and month and year, about stories that are stuck in your head. You can, I'm going to skip that. There is a person who runs a blog. It's actually Ozan Varel, who is an author, and he has a blog about rewriting story. And he talked about, he's from Turkey originally. And so, but he would get stuck in London doing these conferences. And every time he would go to London, he was like, I hate it here. It's so awful. I can't go out. And then one day he finally noticed, he's like, oh, wow, people who live here go out anyway. I'm from the Seattle area, so I can relate. And he started thinking about when he was a kid, it was because adults around him would tell him, you'll get cold, you'll get a cold, you'll get sick. That mud is disgusting. It's like unhygienic, right? So you shouldn't be out stomping around in the mud. Because he liked the rain as a kid. And then he realized it was all those other people's messages. So while he was in London on one trip, he went out, bought a hat, went out, and enjoyed the moist air and the sound of the rain on the leaves. And he said, the point isn't to force yourself to love every rainy day or magically turn into an extrovert by thinking of yourself in that way, but it's about creating space to question the stories you've been living by and experiment with something new. You're not committing anything forever. You're not committing to anything forever. You're just saying, what if? When you play with stories you've been telling yourself, you realize they are just stories. And they often come from someone else. And if you don't like it, change it by just opening a crack in the door. One of my stories that I carried around for a long time was changed right here in Bozeman. And I didn't realize how much this story hurt my soul until after I had fixed it. My mother always told me I had no artistic talent, and I can remember kind of proving that to her a couple times. But I believed that story for decades, and it caused me sadness and envy, and it limited me because I avoided opportunities for artistic creation because I didn't want to be embarrassed in front of other people, nor did I think practice was going to make any difference. I wasn't an artistic person. But over time, I started to realize I'm good with color. I'm good with knowing what goes together, what doesn't. I'm good at knowing what's kind of edgy, that creates this interest, that draws your eye in. So that cracked the door open just this much. And in my 50s, I started talking to my family about how I wanted to keep playing with color by taking a painting class. I wasn't going to create paintings, I just wanted to play with color on a canvas. 2 years went by, I did nothing. Mother's Day came around and my son presented me with paints, watercolor paints, paper, and brushes. And he looked at me like the cat who had just eaten the canary. And he said, "Now you don't have an excuse anymore for not painting." And it was Mother's Day, so what was I going to say? I said, "Thank you so much." But he knew he had me. Then COVID happened. I watched painting on YouTube. But then I came to Bozeman, and through a weird twist of events at the senior center, I tried to join their painting group, and they said, "You can paint with us, but you're too young for this. I want you to go see this other group." And they texted ahead for me. So I ended up in this Friday morning painting group. And I would say they are real painters. They're professionals. They've sold their work for years. And we were painting in a public place every Friday morning, and people would come by and look, and I would kind of hide mine, and I'd say, "Oh, they're the real painters. They're the real artists." And one day, one of those artists grabbed my paper right out of my hand and said, "Stop that. Stop that. You're an artist, and you can't continue to call yourself a beginner." And she held up my work and made me take a more critical look, and she's like, "You paint way above your pay grade." And what she meant was my experience level. I left that day, my chest was puffed out. I was like, "Oh, I'm an artist, I'm a creative." And I will tell you, it spilled over into every other thing I did. Into how I decorated my apartment. As many of you know, I hated my apartment for the first 8 months. but it kind of flipped over into how I decorated my apartment, how I wrote. It filled up everything. And so the sad part about that story is that I wasn't able to provide that affirmation for myself. It took an outside intervention. However, I had already cracked that door. My son had helped me crack that door. I had spent 3 decades in a story that I had no talent. And there's a sense of worthlessness that goes with that. But when I watched it starting to translate to other successes, I even got more creative about my job search. And that's why I'm here. I would have left had the board and I not been creative. So there are also, that is a serious story, but I also know there are more serious stories in people's minds and lives that need to be rewritten. All those negative messages that we internalize over the years that still guard our behavior, they frame our past and how we see ourselves in the future. We get stuck there. So try to go back and just be that third party. Step out of that story. Because when you're in it, you're still anxious, you're still sad, you're still feeling worthless. But if you can step out and say, next time I'm going to do this. I'll leave you with the words of fiction writer Terry Pratchett. Although, is it really fiction? Is it? I happen to believe there's no such thing as fiction. We are always giving out a little bit about our personalities. Pratchett's advice to us is, there is always a story. It's all stories. Really, the sun coming up every day is a story. Everything's got a story in it. Change the story. Change the world.